Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Part 2. I had gotten as far as examples of virtues and the theory, activity and attitude, vice of excess, virtue, the mean, vice of defect. Vice lies in feeling or acting rightly in relation to time, objects, people, motives and manner. Though the mean is variable, since some means lie nearer one or the other extreme, there is a mean for most situations, that middle course recognized by the practically wise or good man. Aristotle himself notes, however, that this account of virtue and vice is not exhaustive. There are some acts and passions inherently bad, such as spite or envy, adultery. Well, that's already never mind. Or murder. There are no mean, right ways of feeling or doing these. Depends, I would have thought. Neither does the theory apply, this is according to Aristotle anyway, in the same way to a major virtue, which is justice. As a particular virtue, rather than the Platonic justice comprehending all other virtues, justice involves the sharing of external goods such as honor or money, and the mean is an intermediate amount, while both extreme are injustice. Distributive justice is a geometrical proportion between persons judged by merit and goods awarded. If A and B are persons and C and D are things, this justice can be formulated thus: A ratio B ratio C ratio D. Equality here is thus not between persons or quantities. It lies in proportional relation. Rectifactory justice involves only the rightings of wrongs in which the gain of one party equals the loss of the other, and the persons themselves are treated as equal. Since Aristotle disclaims universality for the concept of virtue as a mean, the objection of some critics to the inconsistency of his account of justice is beside the point. The virtues and vices tend to be self-perpetuating states of character, or both causes and effects of corresponding actions, but while both acts and character are voluntary, we are clearly aware of specific choices preceding acts, while development of character is gradual and not so obvious. Nevertheless, we are responsible for both. Even ignorance of the right is inexcusable if due to carelessness. The very attractiveness of false gods is due to one's character, just as that which is not really wholesome may appear so to a diseased person. Herein lies the distinguishing feature of the good man. While each character has its own concept of the noble and pleasant, the good man sees the true in each class of things, being, as it were, the norm and measure of them. Though Aristotle's ethics is not a deontological system, it clearly was intended to develop the sort of person that the right rule prescribes. The temperate man, for example, craves for the things he ought, as he ought, and when he ought, and this is what rational principle directs. But the virtuous man is not burdened with a restrictive puritanical sense of obligation. Instead, he enjoys the best life by realizing his highest potentialities as a human being. This is illustrated by Aristotle's description of the properly proud man. Pride, a mean between vanity and humility, seems to be a sort of crown of the virtues, for it makes it greater, and it is not found without them. That was a direct quote from the Nicomachean Ethics. The proud man thinks himself to be and is worthy of great things. He is courageous, honourable and honoured, noble, disdainful of the petty liberal, dignified yet unassuming, frank in expressing his loves and hatreds, a man of few but great deeds. He is independent and incapable of centering his life in another, except for friends. Aristotle writes at length of friendship's necessity to the good life. There are three types. Friendships based on utility, those maintained for pleasure alone, and those between similarity. Virtuous men loved because of their goodness. The last kind is highest, rarest, and most durable. The topic of friendship raises questions of the relations between benevolence and self-love, and here Aristotle anticipates such later writers as Hume and Bishop Joseph Butler. Our estimation of self-love, he points out, requires distinction between higher and lower senses of the term. Selfish concern for wealth or physical pleasure is of course blameworthy, but the true lover of self is he who seeks the most fitting to his highest nature, the just, temperate, and noble. If all sought for themselves the highest good, virtue, self-love, would make for the greatest common welfare. True self-love thus involves beneficence and occasionally sacrifice of wealth, or even life itself, for the sake of friends and country. Thus the good man needs friends in order to exercise virtue fully. The good man also needs the second major type of virtue, the intellectual, for the moral involves choice, and choice is defined as either desiderative reason or rationative desire. Good choice then presupposes right desire and true reasoning. The rightness and truth are measured against the right rule by which Aristotle avoids subjectivism. And I quote, "There is a mark to which the man who has the rule looks. There is a standard which determines the mean states which we say are intermediate between excess and defect." End quote. But pure contemplative intellect does not directly motivate, its end being truth per se. Therefore it is the practical or productive intellect which aims at the truth in harmony with right desire. Practical wisdom is the intellectual virtue most intimately connected with moral virtue. And I quote, It is a true and reasoned state of capacity to act with regard to the things that are good or bad for man." End quote. It is deliberation about the contingent, not the eternal, for its concern is with selecting the best means to the good life. Therefore it is a function of the productive intellect, which can command and sometimes control the irrational soul, the feelings and desires. Practical wisdom is thus a virtue of the calculative level, the lower of the two rational parts of the soul, since it must not only calculate the means, but recognize the ends. And I quote, It is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, not practically wise, nor practically wise without moral virtue." End quote. Thus, intellectual virtue is not mere cleverness. Practical wisdom presupposes intuitive reason, which grasps first principles, universals, and ultimate particulars or specific facts, the raw materials with which practical wisdom does its work. Intuitive reason also furnishes the first principles with which the fourth intellectual virtue, scientific knowledge, logical or mathematical demonstration, operates. This virtue concerns only the eternal, the logically necessary. But the highest form of wisdom involves not only knowledge of the logical implications of first principles, but also comprehension of the principles themselves. Hence Aristotle, calling philosophical wisdom the combination of scientific knowledge and intuitive reason, specifies that it must be directed to the highest objects and be properly completed. From this it follows that it is not directed towards the highest human good, because, and I quote, "man is not the best thing in the world." End quote. Not as divine, for example, as the heavenly bodies, but although not directed towards the highest human good, it is that good. Should a critic object that philosophical wisdom, being merely contemplative, is thus useless, Aristotle reminds us that it makes man happy, not as an instrument, but as an actualized end, the highest human activity. Practical wisdom's command of the body is not a mark of superiority to contemplation, but rather prepares the way for its coming, as medicine is instrumental to health. Before one can fully appreciate Aristotle's concept of happiness, it is necessary to review his treatment of pleasure, regarded by many philosophers as the summum bonum. As usual, Aristotle considers arguments on both sides in some detail. He concludes not only that pleasure is a good, but also that there are cogent reasons for thinking it the chief good. Everyone agrees that its opposite, pain, is bad. Both beasts and men aim at pleasure, and at the start Aristotle had accepted the view that the good is that at which all things aim. And since pleasure is a necessary accompaniment of each activity, carried to its unimpeded fulfillment, happiness would seem to be the fruition in pleasure of at least some or perhaps all of our activities. This latter consideration enters into Aristotle's final formulation of happiness, but there are compelling reasons for denying that pleasure per se and without qualifications is the chief good. Pleasures differ in kind, just as do activities, and since there is pleasure proper to each activity, their values are concomitant. Some pleasures complete acts that are vicious, and some hinder the fulfillment of more worthwhile activities. As Plato argued, it appears that the desirability of pleasure can be augmented by addition of other goods, such as that of wisdom. But one criterion of the final good is self-sufficiency. Pleasure, then, is but an ingredient of that good, happiness. The modern reader must be careful not to identify this happiness with euphoria. It is a state of being, not just one of feeling. It is an activity, and since virtuous activity is also desirable for its own sake, happiness is virtuous activity. As the chief good, it involves the highest virtue, which, as we have seen, is contemplative. Contemplate. Excuse me. Contemplation is capable of more continuity than other actions. It requires fewer material necessities. Its pleasures are pure and lasting. No immediately practical results follow from it, so again it appears to be loved for itself alone. As the highest human activity, it seems most like that of the gods, and indeed it belongs to the most authoritative element in us, and I quote, "That which is proper to each thing is by nature best and most pleasant for each thing. For man, therefore, the life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason more than anything else is man. This life, therefore, is also happiness. This life, therefore, is also the happiest." Whilst this may strike the modern reader as an overly rationalistic or perhaps academic conclusion, Aristotle tempers it by adding that such happiness requires a complete life, including the satisfaction of bodily needs. He recognizes that few men have the ability or the opportunity to lead a life of contemplation. He claims that happiness on a secondary level is the morally virtuous life, for the moral virtues, after all, directly concern our nature in its all too human aspects, since it is a mixture of reason and the irrational appetites. Indeed, most men are incapable of being good through reason and self-discipline alone. They need the aid of legislation. This idea provides the subject of Aristotle's next work, the Politica. If Aristotle's method should appear too speculative for the leading scientist of his day, he reminds his reader that what he has said must be reviewed and tested by reference to the facts, and should it clash with them, it must be considered mere theory. But should the reader adopt this alternative, it must be with reluctance, when the theory is seen as an integral part of Aristotle's whole system. To find the most distinctive human excellence in reason, and yet to allow for the most tonic exercise of the senses and appetites by conceiving both as the full fruition of man's natural potentialities, and to share this actualization as part of the universally purposefully process, is to share one of philosophy's most stirring ethical convictions. The end. Sorry that I buffed my lines. I'm reading from my notes in a bit of a dark room at the moment. Night is drawing in. Good night, everyone.